387, the Aztecs completed the reconsecration of the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, with a ceremony that, according to different colonial era accounts, involved the deaths of thousands of captives over the course of 4 days, arranged in lines stretching across the causeways of the city. Whatever the precise number, and historians still argue sharply over how much these figures were inflated by Spanish chroniclers seeking to justify conquest, the scale itself
the glyphs
was
here
the
match the river on
This
the
wasn't
codex.
excess for its
the
own
tablet
sake. It
suggests
was a
the border
demonstration,
extends
broadcast
west.
to every tributary city
We
and
must
rival state
verify
watching
the
that the
position
Aztec
of the
state
Jaguar
commanded not just
Temple.
territory, but the power of life and death on an almost industrial scale. Empire in this system wasn't just enforced by soldiers, it was enforced by theology. To understand the Aztec state, you
With
have to abandon the
rhythmic
instinct to
precision,
separate its religion
the
from its
skilled
politics,
craftsmen
because in
etched
Tenochtitlan
their
there was no
intricate
meaningful separation to
geometric
abandon.
legacy
The
into
empire's
the
entire
monumental
justification for
stone
existing for
walls.
conquering neighboring peoples,
Look,
for extracting
Master,
tribute,
the
for
glyph
demanding
for the
captives in
eclipse
war rather than
aligns
simply killing
perfectly
enemies on the
here.
battlefield rested on a
Indeed,
cosmological claim
the
that the
priests
priesthood and the ruling
recorded the
class had
cycle
fused into a single,
accurately.
self-reinforcing institution. The sun god, Huitzilopochtli, required human blood to continue his daily battle against darkness. And without that blood, the sun would not rise and the world itself would end. This is worth sitting with as a piece of institutional engineering rather than simply theology, because the logic solves a problem every expanding empire eventually faces. How do you convince ordinary people to keep fighting wars of conquest generation after generation? Wars that are expensive, dangerous, and produce most of their material benefit for a ruling elite? Rome answered this partly through citizenship and land grants. The Aztecs answered it by making warfare cosmically mandatory. If the sun genuinely required sacrificial blood to keep rising, then capturing enemies in battle wasn't merely a military strategy for expanding tribute networks, it was a sacred obligation binding every level of society, from the emperor down to the lowest commoner soldier hoping to distinguish himself. A young warrior who captured an enemy in battle gained enormous social status specifically because that captive could become a sacrificial offering. The entire honor system of Aztec masculinity was structurally welded to the theological demand for captives, which meant the empire never had to coerce its young men into war. It only had to convince them that failing to fight was a failure of cosmic duty. The Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec emperor, sat at the apex of this fused system, and his legitimacy depended on a claim that no European monarch could quite match in its totality. He wasn't simply appointed by God, or descended from divine ancestry in some abstract sense. He was understood as the living intermediary maintaining the literal continuity of the universe. When Montezuma II presided over state ceremony, he was not performing the role of a king overseeing a religious ritual conducted by others.
It depicts
He was the
the
central node
convergence.
connecting the human world to cosmic
the
order,
scroll
a role
confirms
reinforced
the date.
constantly through
It
architecture.
is highly
The Templo Mayor
significant.
itself was built as a physical representation
The
of the sacred
3-mile
mountain
causeway
where creation
was
occurred,
the
and through calendar
lifeblood of
rituals
the
so precise and
empire,
unrelenting that
guarded
ordinary
by
Aztec
the
life was
finest
organized almost
warriors
entirely
of the
around
realm.
religious obligation. There was no civic identity available to an Aztec subject that existed outside this theological frame. Politics wasn't adjacent to religion. Religion was the only available vocabulary for politics. This fusion produced a genuinely effective mechanism of imperial control, and it's worth being precise about how it functioned rather than treating it as simple fanaticism. The Aztec Empire was not, contrary to popular imagination, a single, unified territorial state governing conquered peoples directly. It was a tribute empire, a network of client city-states that retained their own local rulers, their own local gods, their own local customs, and were required only to pay tribute and supply warriors or captives on demand. This is a crucial distinction, because it explains both the empire's remarkable efficiency and its ultimate fragility. Direct administration of a population this large would required an enormous bureaucratic apparatus the Aztecs never built. Instead, the threat of religiously sanctioned, brutally demonstrated violence did the administrative work that a standing bureaucracy would otherwise have had to do. Conquered cities that paid tribute reliably were largely left to govern themselves. Cities that resisted or fell behind on tribute became targets for exactly the kind of overwhelming demonstration performed at the Templo Mayor's reconsecration, a punishment calibrated not merely to punish the offending city, but to be witnessed and remembered by every other tributary watching from a safe distance.
Hands transformed
the obvious
raw
criticism,
stone and
the one that has shaped nearly every popular account of the Aztec Empire since the conquest, is that a state built this explicitly on ritualized violence was inherently unstable, sustained only by terror rather than genuine cohesion.
We stand
and there's a harder,
ready
more uncomfortable truth buried in that criticism that the Aztecs themselves never fully resolved. The same system that maintained obedience through fear also generated the exact conditions for the empire's own destruction. Tributary states that had been conquered by force and reminded constantly through captive taking that their sons might become sacrificial offerings were not loyal subjects. They were subjugated populations waiting for an opportunity. When Herncourts arrived in 1519, he did not conquer the Aztec Empire primarily with several hundred Spanish soldiers. He conquered it by allying with Tlaxcala and dozens of other tributary and rival states who had spent generations under exactly this system of tribute and captive extraction, and who saw the Spanish not as a foreign invasion to resist alongside Tenochtitlan, but as a plausible instrument for finally overturning it. The theological machinery that had built the empire's expansion also guaranteed it would have no allies when the true crisis arrived. The comparative pattern extends well beyond Mesoamerica, and it's a pattern worth naming precisely because it recurs whenever a state fuses religious legitimacy this tightly with military expansion. The Assyrian Empire, centuries earlier and half a world away, built a nearly identical reputation for calibrated, deliberately publicized brutality against rebellious vassals, understanding as the Aztecs did that a single, spectacular demonstration of consequence could substitute for the far more expensive alternative of permanent military occupation.
The curvature
and like the Aztecs, Assyria discovered the same structural weakness tributary populations held in line by demonstrated terror rather than genuine integration will defect the moment a viable alternative appears, which is precisely what happened when the Medes and Babylonians finally toppled Nineveh. A theocratic empire and a purely military one can both conquer efficiently. Neither, historically, has managed to convert conquered fear into durable, willing loyalty, and both eventually pay the same bill. What the Aztec state ultimately demonstrates is a particular, unsettling version of a very old problem.
If we correlate
when the entire
this symbol
cosmological
with the
order of a
Dresden
civilization
Codex,
depends on the
the
continued
sequence
success
aligns
of that
perfectly.
civilization's wars.
Indeed,
Peace
the
itself becomes
convergence
almost
of the
theologically
cycles is
unthinkable.
almost upon
The
us.
Aztecs could not simply stop conquering, could not simply settle into stable administration of the territory they already held, because the sun's continued rising had been institutionally bound to the empire's continued expansion. There was no framework within Aztec state theology for a mature, settled empire at rest. There was only the next campaign, the next batch of captives, the next demonstration of cosmic and political necessity fused into a single unbroken chain until, in 1521, that chain met an enemy the theology had no vocabulary to explain, and the empire that had built its legitimacy on the certainty of the sun's return discovered, within 2 years, that certainty had never been as durable as the architecture built to defend it.